Hello everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. What works? Inspecting encrypted traffic with the Blue Coat SSL Visibility Appliance, sponsored by Blue Coat. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are John Pescatori, Director of Emerging Security Trends for the SANS Institute, and Michael Weinstein, CTO of NetX. If during the webcast you have any questions for John or Mike, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface. We will be answering them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to John.
Okay, thanks Carol, and welcome everyone. I'm John Pescatori. One of the most fun things I get to do at SANS is What Works program, which is where vendors will find a user of their products, either at an end company or an integrator, somebody who's selected and deployed and has experience both in the pluses and minuses of using that product or service to implement a security control, and then I interview them offline. We produce a transcript sort of white paper, and then we do these webinars where you get to hear the user talk and you get to ask questions. So I think it's a good time to be doing that. If you're like me here in the northern hemisphere, it's springtime, sort of the Earth's second quarter, I guess springtime is, and for many of us we'll be going into the second quarter of business. And on security programs, a lot of the sort of New Year's resolutions for this year were to make improvements in security, especially in visibility into what's going on our networks, what's coming in and out of our networks, what bad things and good things are happening, and that's what we're going to focus in on today's What Works webcast, is the use of, in this case, Blue Coat is the sponsor, and their SSL visibility appliance into increasing visibility. So just to give you an idea of what we'll be doing, rough agenda, I'll do a little set the stage sort of overview, and then we'll introduce Michael Weinstein from NetX, and he and I will sort of talk through the problems their customers are facing, what they looked at as solutions, what they went through, and Michael will describe his experience, and we'll drill down into whatever level of technical detail everybody wants to get to. So as we're talking, feel free to submit questions. We'll also save time at the end to go into those detailed questions. You'll see on the right-hand side of your screen this little bar where you can enter questions. Again, as we're talking, enter questions in there. I'll try to be glancing over, so if we're talking about a particular area of selection or deployment or problem solving or whatever, we can answer your questions right then. If you're one of the people listening to the recorded version of this in the future, we'll give you an email address at the end where you can send email questions and you'll get questions back to us. So with that, let's get started. So I think it's always good to sort of set the baseline. I always, in the first quarter of the year, look around at all the various threat reports that are out there and see what sort of interesting statistics may have come out in the new year. And in this case, I looked at the Identity Theft Resource Center statistics. They document all the breaches that are big enough that they have to be publicly disclosed. So these tend to be breaches versus denial of service attacks or ransomware, but it's a good impartial place to look and gives you some good data. So in 2015, there were 781, almost, or more than actually, than 2 a day, calendar day, and more than that if you just go by business days, breaches. But being a positive kind of guy and working on the What Works program, that leads me to think about what did the other 9,200 or so companies in the Fortune 10,000 do differently that they did not make that list. In some cases, they may have avoided breaches. In other cases, they may have detected them quickly enough that they stayed small enough that they did not have to make a public disclosure, which greatly limits the cost to the company. It's still a security failure, but as far as the size and the scope of business damage, it's much smaller. Now, when you look at the Identity Theft Resource Center statistics, on average, there are about a little over 215,000 records exposed per incident. Now, if you take out some of the outliers, 29 million for OPM and those ones that run in the tens of millions, the average drops down quite a bit, closer to 20,000. And you can find many, many in there. There were only a few hundred records out of tens of thousands or millions. So again, what did those do who suffered breaches but had smaller breaches or smaller percentage of their sensitive data actually got exfiltrated? You know, the bottom line, sort of the continuous game in security, is each year to get better at preventing things, but we're never going to stop everything. So what gets through? We need to detect faster, more quickly, so there's more machines or fewer records involved in each incident. And then to improve our techniques and our processes and our capabilities to solve security problems with less disruption to business or resolve them more surgically, whether it's a ransomware attack and restoring backups with minimal loss of continuity or business disruption, or if it is a breach, with knowing the full extent of the breach so we can, restoration actions only have to disrupt the minimum amount possible. You know, the cost of security is what we pay to do the things we do to try to prevent things, and then it's the business disruption cost of breaches. But it's also, I call it the friction, the interference security does with legitimate business needs. So anytime we can have better visibility, quicker visibility, and more accurate visibility, we can reduce the cost in all three of those areas. So look at sort of across 2015 and really here into the first quarter of 2016, we see the sort of overall attack patterns have stayed the same. If I go back, if you look at their statistics here, you see that climbing red curve at the top is hacking, skimming, phishing. It's the standard, it's dominated by sort of the standard phishing front end. There were more sort of skimming attacks, whether on gas pumps, ATM machines, or waiters with the wireless card reader type things where skimming attacks have succeeded. But the dominant trend is still that sort of phishing-driven front end. The goal of stealing user credentials to then gain inside access to PCs and servers and do data exfiltration, or the phishing front end to steer people to compromise websites and from there do either the credential access or the malware insertion. There was still, as you saw from the previous numbers, lots of focus on data theft, lots of big breaches to talk about last year. Certainly the beginning of this year and even late last year, we started to see an increase in ransomware attacks, where rather than steal the data, steal personal health information or personally identifiable information, internal business information or entire hard drives and the like were encrypted to bring the business to a halt and then demand various forms of ransom, whether it's Bitcoin or e-gold or whatever the flavor of the month is. That caught a lot of press interest, definitely more ransomware events happening than early last year, but we've seen ransomware for a long time, and it's still not the dominant trend, but it does bring a new wrinkle to everything. Another trend that's continued really since 2014, accelerated last year, a lot more use by the attackers of clever forms of evasion, certainly a lot more encrypted transport for their communications out to command and control centers or other types of communication, quite often using SSL for one major reason, two major reasons. It's easy to do, and there's also a lot more SSL happening, so it's sort of easier to snuggle in and not stand out using a different form of encryption. Randy Morchani, the CISO at Virginia Tech, who's also a SANS instructor, we were talking at the RSA conference, and they have seen a lot more attackers using sort of taking advantage of split IPv4v6 networks to do attacks that split across the two types, and they find that intrusion detection systems don't necessarily put things together. So another evasion technique, taking advantage of split networks. We're also seeing a lot more persistent encryption, executables that are trying to hide themselves, encrypt themselves until they're executed, and use other ways of sort of hiding their audit trails or encrypting audit trails and the like to increase evasion. Here we're obviously going to focus on more the transport side of encryption, and that really is sort of the low-hanging fruit from a point of view of blinding security monitoring and measurement. So that, the typical breach chain, this is an example from New Century of a real-world attack against the admin of a CFO, and the usual, reconnaissance, targeting phases up front, and then the initial phishing attack and the exploitation of the target and the malware insertion, And then you see there in days 38 to 45 is when, in this case, since it was stealing data, that data exfiltration began. And in this case, it took over 6 weeks before it was noticed. They really did not notice till the stolen information was available on the outside world, out on the web. Now, all along this chain were opportunities to detect and disrupt this. You know, even early on, some of the recon and intel gathering, if we'd have noticed some of the scanning of our spaces or other type of probing, we could have alerted or tagged IP addresses with bad reputations, external IP addresses. Certainly during that first malware insertion phase, a lot of products out there, advanced threat detection products and hardware and endpoint software versions that would have detected an unknown executable or indicators of compromise as an executable started to operate if we could have observed it. And then certainly once the internal machines were used to communicate to other internal machines, in this case the admin's PC was used to communicate and load software on a database server, we could have noticed that. And then obviously at the very end, we could have detected the data flowing from the inside to the outside and determined that it was sensitive data that shouldn't be flowing in that direction. We could have at least disrupted it or quickly disrupted the flow after a smaller number of records or a smaller amount of information got out. Now this focuses on that sort of data theft scenario. If you think about a ransomware scenario, there wasn't going to be external flow of the data, but there was going to be a lot more internal communications as multiple systems and even backup systems were probed to encrypt data, and there would have been a lot of internal actions we could have noticed to say, whoa, looks like something's going on internally here. Let's go check our backups and make sure they're safe and kept separate, and then let's try to halt this as it goes on. Now, obviously, none of these green boxes, these monitoring boxes, could have succeeded if we had no visibility, if we weren't looking, which unfortunately too many people have not been doing continuous monitoring, or if we were looking and we could not see into encrypted traffic. So we're seeing a definite growth in encrypted traffic both externally, and this chart's from Dell SecureWorks with ISP input. And it's showing you the growth over 2014 and 15 of overall HTTP traffic, which you can see is a little slight growth, but SSL or HTTPS type traffic growing at a faster rate, and actually more than 50% of the traffic, this is by connections, are encrypted. Now this has gone beyond just login sessions. Certainly in the past couple of years, we've seen lots of consumer places start to use HTTPS by default, so it's not just for the login session, it's for the whole session. And that's going to continue. Lots of focus on trying to reduce the visibility of governments into data flowing between the commercial providers and their customers. That's just going to continue. We've also seen growth, I couldn't find numbers, unfortunately, it's harder to find, on increased use of application or server-to-server type encrypted traffic on the inside of the network as HTTPS is turned on more and more by default for server-to-server. And just this week, the major email, the Googles, Yahoos, Microsofts, and others of the world announced they were pushing a new internet standard for strict transport security for end-to-end transport encryption on email, from client to mail transfer agent to mail transfer agent to end client. So we're only going to see that increase. So HTTPS can blind us when we're trying to look at what's coming in and out of our network, and also look at what we're trying to see flying around our network as well, as again, more server-to-server and app-to-app encryption becomes the norm. So that's the topic for today, is ways to get that visibility back. And again, in this case, Blue Coat provided a user here, and I'm going to introduce Michael Weinstein right now, and we'll get started with our conversation. Michael, you there?
Absolutely, sir. Thank you.
Okay, great. Why don't we get started? Why don't you introduce your company, your role, and how you got involved in this?
Sure. My name again is Mike Weinstein, and I'm the CTO of NetX. We're a small boutique VAR that provides a number of solutions from what we consider best-of-breed vendors, one of which is Blue Coat, and we've been offering Blue Coat solutions for a number of years now. I worked with them for many years as well prior to this, the company, to being at NetX. And we work on everything from security and networking fundamentals, routers, switches, firewalls, proxies, gateways, secure gateways, reverse and forward proxy, SSL inspection, as we've discussed, and so on.
Okay, so in this area, what was the customer's problem? What type of customer? What was their problem that you're looking to solve?
So we were approached by one of our clients who we do a number of solutions for, a large multinational corp that deals with their internal user concerns of visibility into their traffic. They currently are a Blue Coat Proxy customer, and we do some termination of SSL there for, like, example, looking at webmail traffic and things like that. But a wholesale decryption of data to get visibility back to the tools as the internet shifts more and more towards SSL and away from clear text traffic, and the tools were just losing their visibility. So that was the biggest issue that came up. How do we see into this traffic? How do we use these tools that we've invested in to go ahead and get that visibility back, because they're all blind as soon as the traffic goes over HTTPS. And that was the biggest driver.
Okay, so we all have the same terminology. You're saying the Blue Coat Proxy users, so they were using web security gateway services for blocking of URLs and monitoring of user traffic to websites and the like?
Absolutely, and we were also doing some SSL termination there to give the proxy the additional visibility into things like someone downloads an attachment for your webmail to make sure that gets scanned and make sure it's not an infected file, as you mentioned, those type of things. So that we had some of that visibility in place already, but the problem was the things that were validating our proxy policy, external IPSs and things like that couldn't see this traffic and couldn't give us any visibility as we moved from over the years from 10% SSL all the way up to 40, 50, 60, 70% of the traffic being SSL on the internet.
Okay, now a lot of us sort of have known this as a problem, and it's often been hard to convince management we need to do something or spend money to do something about this problem. Was there some triggering event or an incident or an audit report or something that enabled this customer to get going?
They've been looking at doing the SSL inspection for a while, and the biggest driver was in large organizations like this one, they have different teams that have different responsibilities. There's a separate networking security versus a corporate security team, and the corporate security team, they had utilities that were typically out of path, like the IPS devices, DLP, leak prevention, things like that, that were losing the visibility that they were used to having. And so basically you had this investment in technology solutions and security solutions that was rapidly becoming less valuable. And the only way to give it that value back was to start being able to crack open the SSL. And that was the biggest driver. Any specific incident, I don't know if there was one specific incident. I think there were a number of times where they needed to do investigations and just were blind. And that's what really drove it.
Okay. So can you walk us through the process you used to look at possible solutions and how you ended up with Blue Coat?
Sure. Yeah, it was actually pretty interesting because we took a look at a number of vendors and the solutions that they offered to provide this decrypted feed of traffic to these tools. And what kept coming back to is the biggest differentiator for a lot of the vendors. Really, there were two. One was scale. A lot of the vendors had solutions that worked very, very well, large scale when you're doing a lot of traffic. But if you had smaller sites or a remote office, it didn't necessarily scale very well down to that size. And the other problem that we ran into was, did we really want another HTTP proxy? And a lot of them were HTTP proxy solutions and had topologies that were basically similar to the proxies we already had deployed. We know there are things that we can't decrypt on an HTTP proxy because it's not HTTP inside, but we needed to let it, like WebEx and other online meetings and things like that are running over TLS, but aren't necessarily HTTP inside, or pure HTTP that the proxy could possibly break. And we still wanted visibility into those, but we didn't want to crack them open on the proxy. We knew the end result of that. So this led us to a lot of, testing of various solutions and discovering that, yes, the topologies were difficult, that if it was an HTTP proxy, that didn't help us. We already had that. We already had that troubleshooting infrastructure. We already had that logging and security infrastructure. We needed something that was more protocol agnostic and would not care what was inside the TLS. And that's really what led us to coming back to the Blue Coat solution over and over again. They had various size boxes that we could deploy at remote offices for 250 meg of decryption and up, and then we had to their large boxes that could do, I think, 5 to 10 gig of decryption and could handle 40 gig of traffic going through them. So it was pretty significant range of devices that all looked and felt the same, were just different in size and scale. And they deployed as an inline device, so it wasn't another proxy, and it wasn't an HTTP proxy. It simply looked for the SSL hello. And when it saw the SSL hello, it started decrypting if it could. And that was really impressive for us, that it was just didn't care what was inside.
Okay, got a couple questions I think it'd be good to answer at this point. So one question is, other security devices like next generation firewalls, intrusion detection prevention systems can decrypt and inspect SSL. Did you look at those? Why didn't you select that approach?
Sure, that's a really great question. The first thing that we noticed with a lot of these solutions is they were designed to do SSL decryption, but they may not have the horsepower to do it with modern encryption ciphers, or, and this is a really important thing for us, is as soon as we start doing this man in the middle, we ended up destroying all of the browser's security, because you at the enterprise with this device now take that over. That means I need to be able to have full control of my CA list. I need to be able to say who's trusted and who's not, and if I need to say this CA just got delisted by all the browser vendors, I need to remove it from my desktops. Well, that doesn't help if I remove it from my desktops. I need to remove it from the inline decryption solution. So a lot of these other solutions on the market didn't necessarily do this very well. They didn't give you that management. They just didn't assume that. And many of them also didn't protect the corporate keys that we were using for decryption as well. Once we put this infrastructure in place, your clients now trust the corporate CA infrastructure, and that key that goes with that certificate is pretty valuable. A lot of them will just use the same key for the server certificates as well. So you might be one SSL vulnerability away from that being exposed. The Blue Code actually generates a new key on the fly for every certificate it generates, which is really impressive. When you take a look at the level of security that adds, that means that none of the certificates are using the key that belongs to the trusted certificate chain of the solution that's part of the corporate environment. So that was another big benefit. The management of the CAs, the performance that was spec'd just for SSL, and the fact that it kept up with the modern ciphers, which a lot of the others were very limited in what they could do.
Okay, then we did have a question about the performance and bandwidth that you sort of answered, but I'll go back over it. I think you mentioned sort of the headquarters side you needed in the 5 to 10 gigabit range, and branch offices are like 250 megs or so. Can you talk a little bit about what your throughput requirements were? Is that it?
Yeah, I mean, typically the WAN link at any given site would be the limiting factor, right? If your internet users could use that, and the proxies were there to support that in this case. So what we would end up looking at is the size of the box for the site, and Blue Code has, their SV800 is available in 2 license levels, all the way up to their bigger boxes, the 3800s, which support 40 gig of inline throughput, and I think up to 9 gig or 4 gig. I think the models we use, they have a newer model that supports more of decryption traffic, and that's important because it actually copies off the clear text traffic as well. So you have 2 different measurements, one of traffic that's being decrypted and one of total throughput of the device.
Okay, let me bring up the picture here. Can you sort of walk us through how the flow works, and then rough order of quantity, how many sites, how many boxes you ended up
Sure. Doing? Yeah, absolutely. So it's typically we would limit it to an HA pair, and because these are inline devices, we either used the HA from an existing firewall, for example, or an HA of the proxy that was natively being done already, or we would use something like a Gigamon to help manage the traffic and give us some extra failover capabilities. And that's what you see here, where the traffic would go from the switch to a traffic manager. That manager would put the SSL visibility appliance in line, and then the traffic would go through the SSL visibility appliance, be decrypted, and then go up through the firewall to the proxy in this case. And the proxy, so you'd end up with 2 SSL sessions, one between the client and the SSL appliance, and then another between the SSL appliance and the proxy, the gateways, and then a third actually to the remote site. So you could have a number of these sessions depending on where the decryption was happening and how many times. The traffic then would be copied out of the box, decrypted, and sent to the tools on the right that you see in red there. Those are the passive tools, whatever those might be, IPSs, anti-malware solutions, etc.
Okay, and how many sites roughly were you, and how many users roughly?
So the one client that we deployed, the worldwide deployment, I think it's over 70 sites, almost 100 sites. and varying sizes. They're everything from remote offices to headquarter locations with several thousand users. So they're quite the gamut.
Okay, let's see, a bunch of questions come in here. What sort of inspection policies did you set up?
So the Blue Coat lets you just blanket decrypt everything, which was not necessarily what we wanted to do because of what I call layer 8 issues. HR and legal may not necessarily want or want that to be the corporate, big brother's watching type of feel. So we can actually do categories. You can also exclude things like management devices, etc. So you can put a policy in place on the boxes to tell it what to decrypt and what not to decrypt. And it's pretty impressive because you're not really building a traditional security policy with an allow and deny, although you can do that, but that's what we have the proxies for already. In this case, what you're really doing is just making an action to either bypass decryption or to enforce decryption. And you can do it based upon certificate and host names, SNI, server name indicator, IP addresses, of course, source and dest, and other parameters within the packet headers. But here, what we would do is define the policy and say, hey, for these categories, healthcare, don't decrypt, for example. We don't care if someone's making a doctor's appointment. We don't, but we do care if they're going to a generic website or a hosting site or a hosting provider or whatever, and we can put those categories in place to have them decrypted.
All right, so we did have a question on the data privacy side of things. You mentioned healthcare as one example, might be internal chief legal counsel or something, communications there. How are you able to limit decryption or not encrypt those? You mentioned healthcare. Is that going by categories that Bluetooth has in the web security gateway side, or you do it by Active Directory groups, both? How does that work?
So this box, we did not do any Active Directory integration. It doesn't really do authentication per se or reverse lookups. The proxy certainly can, and there can be some integration done there. But the way we positioned it was, if there's categories that are or websites that are not to be decrypted, banking and finance, for example, we could say, hey, don't decrypt based upon that destination category, and that's a feed from Blue Coat, from their global intelligence network that constantly maintains that, based upon the information in the SSL certificate it would use to identify that this host is of the category banking and finance. As far as anything else, as far as user base, this organization was of the opinion that it doesn't matter, you're on a corporate desktop, you're on the corporate environment. If you're using the internet and you fit those categories, you should be decrypted. So we didn't really have anything, says, executive pool doesn't get decrypted, for example. If there were communications that we needed to exclude, it could be done by IP address, it could be done by destination. It's typically how we would work it. Okay. As far as the layer 8, this organization specifically, the networking team would deploy and manage and monitor this, but the tools that receive the decrypted traffic were managed by the separate corporate security team. So that's how that was done. And those tools only recorded specific things. That helps with the data protection and the privacy concerns for this organization based upon their policies.
Okay, we had a question come in to clarify. This is sort of bump in the wire passive monitoring. The device is not acting as like an ICAP proxy in this deployment.
That is correct. The Blue Coat Proxy web gateways that you see up on the left there, that does have the ability to do ICAP for DLP and for virus scanning, antivirus, anti-malware scanning of files coming down from the internet. This device is a bump in the wire. The security devices in this deployment were out of path, but they can be integrated if you have inline security devices with this device as well. It has different types of what they call segments that you can configure, and you can configure an active out of path or active in path, and the variety of segments that can cover different types of security device deployments. So if you have an IPS, for example, that needs to go in line, as opposed to an IDS that's sitting out of line, this can handle that. The decrypted traffic would go through the IPS, come back out the other side, back to this device, and get encrypted and sent off to the wire. So that is also feasible. Either way can be done. This deployment, however, since we had the proxies as our active security device, all the other devices were monitoring and listening tools in this specific case study that we're doing.
All right, so related to that question, does the Blue Coat product support only one network segment? Is that why you used the packet broker in your diagram?
The packet broker was used for a couple of reasons. In the larger sites, it gave us a little bit of extra resiliency, so when we decided to maintain networks and things like that, we could flip a switch and throw the box out of path if we needed to. It also provided an external layer 2 health check through the Blue Coat solution to give us something besides its own failover on the NICs. So the devices do have the ability to fail on network or fail to wire if they unplug them and things like that. But like any device, it's also good to have an external health check, and it's hard to do a health check on a device that's wire-based. So the packet broker gave us the ability to do that. The other nice thing about that is, we're paying for the intelligence and the throughput here, and the port density depending upon how many tools we needed to feed, and if we needed to filter some of that decrypted traffic. Say, some security team is doing an investigation, only needs to see, for legal reasons, can only see traffic from this one host. We could filter that on the packet broker easily coming out on the feed from the Blue Coat SSL decryptor. So that gives us a couple of extra layers of flexibility and resiliency there beyond the capabilities of the native box because of port limitations and density and things like that.
Okay, you mentioned the CA list that the Blue Coat product keeps and how it helped deal with a lot of those issues. One of the big downsides of doing this thing in inspecting desktop SSL to external world traffic has been problems the users run into or boxes they have to click. How transparent is all of this to the desktop user?
There's definitely some planning involved, and if it's planned well, it's much easier, right? If you have the right tools in place to manage the desktops, it's very easy to push out the certificates. Microsoft Integrated is obviously the easiest. Firefox is a little harder, right? Because you have to push to a separate CA store. But for Macs, there's also you need utilities to go ahead and deliver those certificates so that the clients trust the corporate CA infrastructure, because now you basically are a CA for the internet, and you are issuing certificates for sans.org, for example, right? So that means, when you're going to bluecoat.com and sans.org, the CA issuer is now the corporate CA infrastructure, which the Blue Coat solution is now spoofing those certificates on the fly. So that needs to be trusted. It is transparent to the end users if that CA chain exists already, which in many Microsoft shops it does. But different browsers have to be handled a little differently depending upon the deployments and how the devices, the endpoints are managed.
All right, so you mentioned planning. When you made the decision which product to use, roughly how long did it take you to go operational? Obviously picking the sites to go operational with is the big thing in our case. Because of the major corporate sites being local to us, we actually went with with the larger sites first. So that took a lot more planning as far as integration and signatures and primary side one weekend, secondary side the other. So we didn't unplug the whole infrastructure to put these boxes in line all in one day. But it was relatively straightforward. Once the devices were in line, it was just a matter of configuring policies as we need to get the results we wanted. Because the proxies in this environment were already doing the decryption, all that planning for the desktop integration had been done already. So it was completely transparent to the end users. It had already been done. We had already worked that out. So it worked out very well. We probably went operational after making the decision, putting the boxes in line and getting them physically planned and cabled, etc., which you're doing a lot of inline cabling, so that can be difficult in a large environment. But we got that done in one day. Once we picked the day, we got it done, planned 2 weeks of planning ahead of time, deployed in one day, and then implementing policy on the fly as we needed. All right, you mentioned for the larger site, tens of appliances. How do you manage those devices? Is there some centralized management server approach? Do you touch each device? How does that work?
Yeah, so the Blue Coat does offer their central management solution, which can deploy policy and things like that and have system managing the boxes globally. A lot of it, once we've picked the policy, is kind of managed dynamically with the Blue Coat Global Intelligence Network feed. They know what healthcare is. I can always ask them to adjust that, and say, hey, I want this site added to this category, and if it's valid, they go ahead and do so. You can create your own lists on box, et cetera, as well. And that can be managed as well. So they do have a central management solution. Once it's in and running, the management of the devices, aside from policy changes, is minimal. These are really bumps in the wire, and either they'll decrypt or they won't decrypt, right? So you're not constantly adding things to be blocked or allowed here, so it works pretty well.
All right, we had a question. What you deployed, are they separate physical appliances? Are any of them virtualized versions? Does Blue Coat have an option where you could load a virtual version of the inspection appliance?
They are inline devices, so that makes virtualization pretty tough. To date, I'm not aware of any virtual version that is offered. It's all hardware-based, and they are either fixed port or chassis type configurations that you can install net mods in as you need, depending upon the medium, whether it's fiber or copper where you're deploying them. So I haven't seen that. Typically, you also have choke points and you have other devices to feed. Promiscuous devices also tend to be specific as well, physical devices. So you also need that connectivity for them to plug in as well. So that works kind of back to not having a virtual version of the appliance. They also have dedicated hardware for doing this in high-performance environments. It's not just general-purpose CPUs. So I don't believe that a virtual version would meet any but the smallest requirements. And inline requirements for having a fail-to-wire, if you're an inline device, can be tough in a virtual environment too. So there are some physical limitations there to the deployment methodologies that are needed for putting this in. So everything we've done was all physical.
Okay. Now, whenever anybody puts anything in line, there's a lot of concerns, disruption, latency, jitter, et cetera. Can you tell people what you went through and what you think they should go through to think through deployment to make sure, you got all the bases covered and you're not disrupting legitimate traffic?
Sure. I mean, you're definitely, if you're deploying this in path at some choke point, be it a firewall, a proxy, or any one of the such, that's going to be disrupted during that deployment. With enough resiliencies and no single point of failure in the network design, that's what we took advantage of for our deployments, and that we would either put it on the backup and then fail over. Once we saw everything working, we were good to go. During our testing, we didn't really measure, but packet captures illuminated that, hey, there was not a big deal as far as how much latency was added by the device. It was negligible. We're already going through proxies. We already have internet access. When we put ourselves on the device and started decrypting, didn't see any difference. The only difference we had was now we had visibility into that traffic to the tool sets that needed it. So that was not a concern, right? It's internet traffic anyway, so typically in this environment, it was all internet-based traffic. If it was email, it's even a little less sensitive to those milliseconds of latency. So that type of thing, which of course, any type of TLS traffic, this can pick up on. It looks for that SSL hello and starts doing its job. So it's pretty impressive. Okay,
I got a question for you. In your work across multiple customers, do you have some feel for what % of their traffic you're running into SSL encryption?
For internet-based traffic specifically, we've absolutely seen it climb rapidly in the past 2 to 3 years. I mean, Google drove that with rating sites that are SSL better than sites that were not, for the same content. There's all these things, and you mentioned the strict transport security extending beyond just HTTP now, and you're making sure it's end-to-end on emails. All the vendors are driving in that direction. They're trying to protect their users as well as themselves. So we've absolutely seen it climb. I would probably say close to over 50%, maybe close to 60 at this point, where everything Google, everything, all the search engines, all of the social media sites are all SSL now. So it's quite prevalent, and it's a majority of the traffic. And to do any type of controls on it, even from the proxy level, we'd have to decrypt, and to get any visibility back to the tools, again, you need that decryption.
Okay, we had a question. Do you know if the solution can obfuscate particular data? If you're or breaking some session, there's a certain type of data, whether it's credit card numbers or personal identifiers. Does solution do any of that sort of pass-through obfuscation?
Well, that's a great question, and it was absolutely a concern from the layer, more the layer 8 perspective. This box, because it is a TLS device, right? It's an SSL proxy. It doesn't understand necessarily what's going on inside it and doesn't act on it. It just copies it. whatever tool that you're using would have to do that when it records the data, if it records it at all. You know, there was some discussion that the one client had that with that type of concern, and they said we're only going to record packets that come to us that we deem are malicious. So in that case, it was less risk that, hey, you know, if it's a virus coming down, that's going to be recorded. If it's a URL that is known bad, that's going to be recorded. But, you know, personal identifiable information, that wouldn't necessarily be recorded when you went to your bank if we were decrypting that. So this device doesn't have that level of integration, but I think that would definitely fall more to the responsibility of whatever you're feeding off of it.
Okay, that feeds into a question. You mentioned IDS, IPS, sort of inline devices you might feed. What other sort of network security devices have you used and integrated with this?
Without going into specific vendor names, I've absolutely used anti-malware solutions that are passive, that sit out, that can sit in path. We've had them out of path. I've used Wireshark even for troubleshooting, you know, to see what's going on inside certain things. You know, everything from Wireshark on a laptop to just to IPS is the Blue Coat's own security analytics, getting feeds off of this. So those are the types of devices that really thrive off of this data, that can take that raw data and tell you what's going on, either security only or even performance, etc.
I had a question here. I guess I'll add a bit to it. Are you seeing any use of Speedy or HTTP2? And if you did, can this handle it?
So it's a great question. Those are obviously identifiable during the SSL hello by the client and the server in the I think it's ALPN, alternative protocol, or next protocol headers. And yeah, without a doubt, this has no issue with those because it is just decrypting. That really identifies what happens after the SSL layer is peeled back. You know, other things come up though that do cause issues that Blue Coat reacts to, like extended master secret. You know, one weekend Microsoft just enabled that for their own sites in one of their Tuesday updates, and all of a sudden, you know, extended master secret is designed to ensure that you don't have a man in the middle. Well, this device needed to be able to go ahead and say, oh, I see this header, make sure it doesn't pass. Normally, it doesn't touch. It touches as little as possible in the SSL setup to make sure that it's trying to keep it as pristine as possible. And when that header started, Blue Coat needed to go ahead and say, okay, we need to overwrite that header. It's an experimental header. It's been added by Microsoft. Google is starting to use it in some places. So we definitely had to address that and make sure that that was addressed so that we can continue to do our job. But things like Speedy, they will work through this. You know, WebSockets. Once the SSL is opened up, it's up to the device that we're feeding to go ahead and understand that protocol and have a dissector.
Okay, we had a question. So you can use the appliance to decrypt traffic, forward it on. Is there any alerting the Blue Coat appliance does itself? The particular example they used here was if there's a session that continues after revoked cert is identified, or is there any sort of alerting the Blue Coat appliance does on its own?
So it can, and it actually has some very, very great, you know, really intensive logging that it does of the SSL sessions that are going through it. So, for example, you might decide that you want to do certificate enforcement here, that if you see a certificate going to some list of hosts or beyond a whitelist of certificate names, to say, hey, if it's not a valid certificate, shut it down. And you're not going to get a fancy alert on your end user desktop or anything like that, but it will kill the session. So it can do those sorts of things, but it can actually help you in other regard because all of that's logged. So you can easily see that, hey, this certificate was invalid, this chain's not good, this cipher suite is weak. I've actually noticed in looking through the logs when I was just monitoring the solution after we put it up, make sure there were no issues, that some security tool, other security tool in the environment that was communicating with some cloud service from that vendor was using, you know, less than optimal, an old security protocol from the cipher suite perspective. And, you know, it enabled us to go ahead and call that vendor and say, hey, you know, why are we, you're a security vendor, why is this device not using a modern cipher suite in its communication to your cloud? What's going on in that communication? Do I need to be concerned? Can it be fixed, and when? So things like that, it can really help with. But as far as a specific alert, you know, once you put this in line, you'll see a lot of things going on as far as certificates going back and forth and what it can see. And I don't know if you'd want an alert every time it saw an invalid certificate. The users will certainly get the prompts at the desktop if you're permitting it, but if you deny it here or deny it on the proxy, as with we can also do on the Blue Coat Secure Web Gateways, you can do that there as well. In that case, the user can get an error message, or even coach to continue. So it's a little less, I see a lot of the alerting here you really want is device level if it's having an issue, things like that, CPU, whatever. But as far as, again, like I said earlier, its policy is not really a security policy per se as an encrypt-decrypt policy. So you're enabling other security devices that would alert you when they saw something else within the session. But your logs could reveal that, and you could probably set that easily enough up on a SIM or something to alert you if you saw something specific, like an invalid certificate to this host.
Okay, here's a question. We've sort of focused on the sort of internal desktop user to the outside web world of SSL decryption. Have you done any deployments integrating this with things like F5 Big Iron, load balancers, and more on the server side of SSL?
So I've done a lot of infrastructure work with a number of clients with SSL as a reverse proxy, if you will, which the load balancers act as, using load balancers, using Blue Coat proxies and other devices. This device can, has a design function where it can also be out of path if you load the server private keys. However, because of perfect forward secrecy and elliptical curve and all of that, that kind of goes away as a method of decryption. I'm not so sure it's really, if you're decrypting on the balancer and then you're going to forward clear text to the server, the visibility would be there for these tools if you're looking at an IPS, for example. If, however, for some reason you're re-encrypting to the back end, to the servers, and there's a couple reasons that would be needed. You could possibly, because it's private side, you could use this basically as a out-of-path decryptor or in-path to feed other devices and leave it there. I haven't seen that as a use case because, as I said, the balancers typically have hardware for dedicated decryption in them, so they perform and do that very well. And you can get feeds off the clear text traffic that's going to the backend servers in most cases. So I haven't deployed it in such a fashion. It does have several modes that lend itself to those types of environments as well.
Okay, here's a question. You come in with your clients as a sort of an outside VAR integrator. Typically, in making a decision to deploy a product like this, what internal groups get involved? I mean, obviously the security group, is it the network group? Are there other areas that need to get involved within the company to make the decision?
If there's no decryption being done as well, especially when it comes down to what we're going to be doing with this data and what is theoretically possible to be seen and what the expectation of privacy and the acceptable use policies that are in place in the organization are today, I typically recommend a discussion with legal and or HR to have a good understanding that, hey, this is the corporate environment. Here's what we're going to do to protect it. Here's what we're going to do to protect the expectation of privacy and what's required. That's beyond, well, I always joke that I'm layer 1 through 7 and that's layer 8. So you'll tell me what I need to do and I'll just enforce it on the box, whether that means we don't decrypt government, we don't decrypt healthcare, we don't decrypt banking and finance. But everything else is go ahead and decrypt. That's what we can do. But depending upon the size of the environment, you are typically, as you said, dealing with, John, the security teams and the networking teams. And at that point, you may also need to integrate with the desktop teams if it's a large enough environment they have separate because of the deployment of the CA certs if it's not there.
Okay, here's the turtles on top of turtles question. Can it handle SSL inside of SSL?
I believe it would just decrypt the first SSL hello. I have worked in environments that have that, and you have to, I'm trying to think of how, with its processes, it's not going to do an inspection beyond the first SSL packet unless, in theory, I ran it back through the box, but that could get a little confusing. If it's double decryption, that always presents a challenge.
Yeah, that might be a better question. We'll have the Blue Coat people get your response on that. How about if, I don't know if you've used any certificate pinning. How does it handle where certificate pinning is used? Do you know?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things that are out there that can cause some concerns, obviously. Certificate pinning is typically, I haven't run into it in the enterprise environment much. I believe it happens most with mobile apps, and I think it's getting used less and less for some things because obviously you need to keep the app up to date as certificates expire, so that becomes a little more difficult. because now you have an association with a given service and host name, and that certificate is stored on the local client. So that can be a challenge. Client-side certificates are obviously also a concern. OCSP stapling, the box does handle, so that's fine if you're familiar with OCSP stapling as a concern. It absolutely spoofs all of that as well. So that works. But certificate pinning is a problem for man-in-the-middle in general. But I don't see it that often, and I haven't run into it. And if we do run into it and it's a permitted app, we would just whitelist it because it wouldn't be getting decrypted anyway. The app wouldn't accept it.
Okay, I had a question about integrating with HSMs. Is there any issue if hardware security modules are in use in the enterprise?
I believe it has a full integration with HSMs. I haven't done it, but it was built. This product is not a new product. It's newer for Blue Coat. They acquired the solution and have obviously enhanced it, but I believe it's been used in environments with HSMs without a concern. There is an HSM integration.
We're sort of nearing the end of our time. Let me jump to some of my standard questions. So how long have you been operational now?
I guess we started the planning about 2 years ago, so probably within 6 months to 9 months we started our first deployments and have been rolling them out since. So I would say over a year at this point.
All right, so based on what you know now, are there any lessons learned or things you would do differently starting out that you can pass on to the audience?
Yeah, I think that the biggest challenge with these types of devices is one of the questions stated, it is a bump in the wire, and you need to make sure your infrastructure is planned for that, your resiliency is planned carefully, your choke points are planned carefully. I think that's the hardest challenge to overcome because it's barely a layer 2 device, it's more of a layer 1 device on the network. So it really lends itself to how am I going to deploy this, where am I going to deploy this, what type of resiliencies do I need or not need? And that all needs to be considered as part of that. Once the box is in line, you're good to go. It's that beginning stages of how you're going to do that and where you're going to do it and what your resiliency requirements are for the specific environment are the biggest challenges. I think there's enough knowledge of SSL out there in most of the enterprises that they believe it's a concern. So I think rolling out certificates and things like that is all accepted at this point, especially with the prevalence of next gen firewalls and others that do this similar type of man in the middle. But I think that layer 1 deployment is very easy, but it needs to be planned properly. And that to me is the biggest challenge that I see. As far as what else, it's SSL is a big learning curve, and you discover how much you don't know when you start doing this and you start troubleshooting and start understanding what's going on. And you see what the data the box provides. So that's another big thing that you just want to have a vendor like Blue Coat who does this every day. It works well for that. And because the box has been designed to protect the endpoint security and that it does give you the abilities to replicate the browser security model for SSL on the appliance, which a lot of the other vendors that we looked at didn't. And that to me went a long way, and that's really something you have to kind of look at is, hey, what happens the next time a CA gets blacklisted by the world and I'm doing this? How do I handle that? And that's a good question because it's going to happen again. It's happened in the past.
All right, we did have a question. The example you used here, there was awareness of this increased encryption, blinding security products and the like. So there was awareness of this loss of visibility. With the various business and enterprises you work with, how high do you think that level of visibility is? I mean, is it commonly understood? Is it something we still need to get the word out about? Or is it more people understand the problem and are looking for solutions? What do you think?
I would tend to say that the word still needs to get out. I mean, recently I saw an article that said, CTOs are wasting money, and it was exactly this: is that people are spending money on solutions that have no visibility because of the prevalence of SSL and the growth of SSL and TLS. So that's still going on today, and I know a lot of enterprises, even that I deal with, are who have the solution as far as a proxy deployed that can do this, that are looking to go ahead and do that, and haven't yet because of it just hasn't gotten the management sign-off yet. But the critical controls from SANS, right? They list you need to have a decrypting internet proxy at the edge. That's why I use that constantly as an example. That hey, this isn't me saying this. This isn't a VAR coming in and saying this. This isn't Blue Coat saying you need this. These are people that do security for a living and are not vested in any profit on your network. They're saying you need to have this visibility because this is the way to get stuff into the network that blinds the tools. And I think more and more it's becoming aware, and I think some of the statistics you showed at the beginning show that, but I still believe that through some of the enterprises there's a, hey, we're protected, we're good, and they don't have any of that visibility. The word definitely still needs to get out.
Yeah, and one reason I like doing the What Works program is at SANS is I think the other word that needs to get out is that there are people successfully doing this without causing a bajillion calls to come into the help desk because disrupting users' web experiences, whether it's this or it's a whole bunch of other areas where there's these sort of common myths that, oh, nobody can do that because users won't stand for it. Yet I continue to find places that are doing it successfully, and that's what we try to publicize in the What Works program. All right, let's see, just about out of time. I'll give you one last sort of standard question. Any sort of features or requirements you've sort of asked of Blue Coat or you hope to see coming along soon?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely looking forward to a little more unified as far as the ability from the central manager to control more and more of the appliances as they bring it into that fold. So it can do some things today and some things it just are newer for it in the way it pushes out the policy and the way the box is handled. I would definitely like to see more of the security-centric features, like it has the ability to detect heartbleed, for example, kind of an older thing at this point, but IPS is still trip on it all the time as people try to exploit it. And you can put that in policy so you can see that. Like to see that with other things, like, hey, not only log the cipher suite, but also log if it's weak, if like Diffie-Hellman with logjam type of thing. I would like to see more of that, and I think they have that ability. It's just a matter of prioritizing it and getting out there with a lot of the other features they're putting into it.
All right, how do you rate the support of Blue Coat?
I've been using them for years, so it's been very, very good, and obviously when you're dealing with something like this, you're dealing with a complex topic even for our industry, TLS, so it tends to be pretty strong. They tend to escalate to the right people pretty quickly and make sure you get the right answers. So the code has been coming out. I mentioned the extended master secret concern came out, and that's obviously something you can't control when Google's going to push an adjustment out to Chrome, or when Microsoft puts in their patch Tuesday, hey, we're going to enable this for our websites in IE. And they rolled right out in a couple days. They had a patch out that you could upgrade, and now it would handle all of that. So it's been pretty good.
Okay. Anything else I didn't ask or questions that didn't come up you'd like to add?
No, like I said, the one other benefit that we mentioned, we talked earlier, John, was that I've used this prox to validate other security solutions, even to the point to see if they are susceptible to man in the middle. I've broken open cloud service reporting from other security devices and said, hey, how come you're not validating certificates and things like that? I didn't import anything, so you shouldn't let me man in the middle. So as far as that, it's been a great tool for helping ensure that other devices that I put in the network have secure communications where they need to. So that's been a kind of a boon in that regard too.
Okay, we're just about out of time, so I want to, whoops, come on, went past, we did those. Leave everybody with a list of resources. There's the URL for where all the What Works case studies are published. Mike mentioned the critical security controls, which are now shepherded by the Center for Internet Security, and there's a link to getting to those, and you'll see us, SANS, continuing to support those and doing a lot of work around that. The next big SANS event is SecWest out in San Diego in the first week of May. There's a URL for that. There's our sponsor, Blue Coat's URL. We can get more information on this appliance and their other products and services. If you are listening to the recorded version of this, or you came up with a question just too late to get in, you can send it to q@sans.org, and we'll get you an answer. And there's my Twitter handle if you want to tweet at me later on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carol for some final words.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael and John, for your great presentation, and to Blue Coat for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, you can visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.